G'day folks, welcome back to another episode of Stuff and Such. We're back on the HUSQVARNA conversion to 272, and as you saw in the last video, if you watched it, we had issues with the carburetor not really fueling. So that's kind of a fairly big issue. As you saw, it only run on choke, and no matter how far I unscrewed the jets, they wouldn't provide enough fuel. So anyways, we're going to kind of give you a little bit of a tutorial on how I feel the carburetor works. I'm not a trained professional, but this is kind of what I've learned over the years. So the way this carburetor works is off a 2-stroke, obviously chainsaw. Now how a 2-stroke works is that, and you kind of have to understand that a lot of people don't really understand. Yeah, here's a very, very dirty bottom end. So a lot of people don't realize that on the underside of the pistons, the piston goes here, inside the crankcase becomes pressurized on the downward stroke. And what that does, it pushes fuel around the piston through the ports in the cylinder wall, and also it creates pressure that runs this little hole up here. And what that does is it provides a little bit of pressure like that, and it pushes on the fuel pump inside the top of the carburetor. Before I'm going to get too far in this video, I'm going to ask you to subscribe. I know it's kind of annoying every time someone asks you, but unfortunately that's the only way this channel will grow, is if we gently remind people to kindly subscribe and join us on the journey of this channel. Anyways, let's get into it. So first things we need to kind of sort of understand is how the pressure on the underside of the piston works. So I'll quick draw a little. So here's the piston over here, connected to a rod inside your cam, and it circles around and goes up and down as this goes around. So inside so this is the cylinder wall and your crankcase. So as the piston goes down, what that does is your pressure increases as it goes down. So how it works, from when the piston's at top, dead center, so at the very top, what happens as this piston travels down, it's starting to build pressure, and then it goes back up and the pressure goes back down. And as the pressure goes back down, it's also creating a vacuum that sucks the fuel into the bottom. So this is kind of your PSI curve. Goes up, down, and every stroke up, down, up, down. So that's fairly straightforward to understand. So we'll keep this in mind, and then we'll go into the piston, or into the carburetor. First thing we're going to get into is the fuel pump. Just take a quick peek at it. Make sure it's not punctured. Make sure it's still fairly pliable. Alright, so in here is your piston, or in here is your fuel pump. So what happens here is the air impulse from underneath the piston comes through this little hole, up this hole here, travels through this little hole, and then pumps into this cap. So what that does is every time it strokes, it pumps the fuel. So overall, this looks fine. So let's throw it back together here, the top, and then we'll go and check the bottom. In here we have the needle valve, I believe it's called. So what the needle valve does is basically it limits the amount of fuel coming in. So where we are now, this is where this drawing comes in. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the correct tools to appropriately set this carburetor. I did somewhere and I lost them somewhere in the move, but anyway, so what you want to do is set your pop-off pressure. Now essentially what that is you put your fuel, or you put an air vacuum and pressure gun on here. And I forget what it is, but I think it's like 5 psi that you want to be able to pump in here and have it pop. So what that does, by having your spring with too much tension on it, that changes this. So let's say, I can't remember the numbers, but let's say the top of the psi curve is 10 psi and the bottom is 0. So if you have too much spring tension on here and your pop-off pressure is too high, what will happen is that, so let's say it's set for 9. And they're usually always the same. Anyways, so let's say it's set at 9. Is what will happen is you won't be able to get enough fuel, obviously. But let's say you do have just enough fuel that you can actually tune it and it'll run properly. What will happen is, because it has so little fuel when it needs it, and when you want to go and first start your saw, every time you pull it over one stroke, it's limited to this section of how much fuel it will get. So that means, if, let's say you needed, I don't know how to explain it. Let's say you needed 20 millimeters of fuel, that's just a random number, and you only get 3 or 1 milliliter each, or 1 cc. Then you'd need to take more pulls, so 3 divided by 20 is, I don't know, 7-ish. You might need 7 pulls to start your saw just to get enough fuel. But if you have your pop-off pressure set mid-range, then you can now get all this fuel, all this fuel, and you can reduce how many times you have to pull your saw with the choke on, because you're still limited to, every time you pull the saw, it has to reach max PSI, then it can fuel wherever the pop-off pressure is. So if it's here, it'll start fueling. If it's here, it won't start fueling until here, and then you just need to pull more often. Likewise though, if you have it set here, well, there's a good chance that, like if it's set at almost 0, there's a good chance that you won't be able to really have any control of your saw. It's just, you got to find that happy medium, and I think it's 5 psi, but I can't quite remember. So what I think is happening now with my carburetor is it's set really high. It's just getting enough fuel that at max fueling set, that it will just run on choke. So I'm thinking I'm going to maybe clip a coil off the spring and perhaps raise my level a little bit, like raise my level of my lever, so every time it pulses it also opens it up a little more. You pop this screw out a little bit. So there's the little spring there. So I'm going to knock off a couple coils. I also feel like the lever isn't quite high enough. And this thing also works similar, that this thing can only, rather your diaphragm can only travel so far. And if this thing is too low, it can only pump a little bit of fuel. Pretty sure I'd read once that it's supposed to be level flush with the bottom of the, like level with this, but it always seemed like that was a bit too high. So that's pretty well going to use up all of our time for today. Right now it's 9 o'clock at night and it's dark outside, so I'm not able to throw it in the saw tonight and give it a try for you guys. But hopefully this video kind of helps you understand a little bit how the carburetor works. And also maybe understand a little bit why you have to pull more on your saw to start it, but once it's started it works perfect. Often that has pretty much everything to do with your pop-off pressure. It's kind of something you just need to sit and think about for a while, and you'll get it figured out. Well folks, that's going to wind up today. Hopefully you found some little bit of insight into this video on how carburetors sometimes work. So I'm excited to throw this in. Hopefully it does the trick. If you have any questions that I probably didn't explain very well, just leave me a comment down below and hopefully I can help you out a little bit. Anyways, thanks for watching. As always, we'll see you next time, and please subscribe.